All right, let's jump into our next segment, boys. This week on Neds, Neds has become the official betting partner of the UFC in Australia, and we've teamed up with the legends at Neds to bring you some ROB content every single week. Boys, I know we want to touch on a little bit of last week's. So, Statman, where are we heading today?
Perfect. So we've done 2 blog posts now, and they've been posted on the Neds site, and they've also been posted on their Facebook, and there's been 1 or 2 comments that kind of caught my attention. Ben B, on our first post about most enjoyable MMA trilogies of all time, Ben B chucked out the Velasquez and Dos Santos trilogy deserved a mention. It didn't. It just straight up didn't. The first fight was a 64-second knockout from Junior Dos Santos. The next 9 rounds of that fight, of the 2 trilogies, was just Cain Velasquez giving Junior Dos Santos CTE, and it was difficult to watch. It was all 3 fights were blowouts, and by the third fight, which came, I think it was about 3 or 4 months after the second fight, no one was hyped for it. It was probably one of those moments where the UFC rushed to do a trilogy fight that could have had years of build up to the third consequential meeting, but didn't have it. There was also a shout out in there for Frankie Edgar versus Gray Maynard, which is one of my absolute favorite trilogies as far as a skill set goes. But it wasn't necessarily as an impactful a trilogy as the other 5 on the list. And a lot of the ones on the list that we went for were about that impact, the holding power that those fights had on shaping the UFC as a company. And Frankie Edgar versus Gray Maynard 2 and 3 were both sensational, potentially fight of the year candidates, but they did not shape the UFC in the way that the other 5 did. Last week's one was the top 5 unranked Dagestani fighters in the UFC. And there was just one comment that kind of caught my eye from Aaron P. And he said, I hope they're not all as boring as Khabib. He used a very, very funny replacement word for Khabib. It's a kebab. Haha, very funny. But obviously, if you look at Khabib as a fighter and you think that he is boring, he's just not boring. And he rightfully got called out in the comments, and hopefully just doesn't read anything else upcoming. That'd be awesome.
I thought we were doing Tool of the Week later in this podcast.
Yeah. Statman's nomination for Tool of the Week.
I'm stepping on your toes. I'm sorry, Stoney. I got about halfway through. I was like, I'm stepping on his toes.
Remember when Statman took over breaking news?
Yeah.
Just, mate, you just tackle your own segments.
For ages. Jesus Christ.
But this week, following on from the return of Misha Tate at UFC Vegas 31, and in anticipation of the long-awaited comeback of former bantamweight champ TJ Dillashaw, this coming weekend, we take a moment to look at the top 5 most iconic octagon returns in UFC history. Number 5?
Spot on, Statman. Number 5. Now, what would it even be a top 5 without Ken Shamrock? I think not, DL. I haven't tried to get him in the top 5 Dagestani prospects, but Statman was not having a bar of it. Boys, we go all the way back to 2002. Now, context is everything here, DL. The Fertitta brothers had just brought the UFC. It looked like an absolute shambles of a deal. They were doing terrible numbers. They needed someone to bring it back. Now, Kenny Shamrock had 4 years in the WWE. He came back 2002. We've been through it many times before. Tito Ortiz rivalry. Did 150,000 pay-per-views, which sounds small in today's market. It was quadruple the previous 3 cards at the time. Single-handedly turned the momentum of the entire company, and that's why Ken Shamrock's return at UFC 40 comes in at number 5, Statman.
Number 4 for us is Ronda Rousey. And again, this is another one of those items where we talk about the significance of the fight and then the significance of the return. And I don't think it can be understated how significant a figure in MMA, specifically women's MMA, but MMA in general, Ronda Rousey was. One of the fighters on the card that we're picking a fight for later tonight, Marina Maverick, specifically states watching a Ronda Rousey fight in 2016 as the reason she got into the sport. Now she's a top-ranked flyweight fighter. So Ronda Rousey is a big deal. And she took a hit to the confidence at UFC 193 in Melbourne. I was there live. Stoney, were you there?
100%. Absolutely was there.
And
I was also there, just by the way.
Oh, DL. Sorry, yes.
Yeah.
Also
Don't
there.
worry about
Snags?
me.
Snags?
I've been to UFC events as well. Just to let you know, Statman. Not just Stoney.
So, Stoney, you remember the feeling of the electricity in the arena. And the shocking half-second hush when she got kicked in the head by Holly Holm, and then the explosion of noise. There was wails, but there was so many cheers. She was quite a polarizing figure, and she kind of disappeared. It's often really, really impressive to see how a fighter handles that defeat, and Ronda Rousey, by her own admission, did not handle it very well. And she came back at UFC 207 against the new champion, Amanda Nunes, who we now know is an unstoppable force. And the hype behind it was huge. There was also the return of Dominic Cruz against Cody Garbrandt that night as well. And it didn't last very long. It lasted just over a minute, or just shy of a minute, I believe, when Amanda Nunes showed the world why she is the most dominant pound-for-pound women's fighter. And Ronda Rousey has not been seen again, not in a UFC cage, at the very least. Definitely made her way to WWE, but hasn't been seen in the UFC since.
Yeah, good one, Statman. 1.1 million pay-per-views as well, that one. So huge numbers for a card headlined by the women's division. At number 3, we go all the way back, DL, to UFC 217. So following 9 straight welterweight title defences, GSP decided to hang up the gloves after UFC 167. I thought it was a good decision. I thought the division was catching him. I didn't know how long the reign would last, so when he hung it up, it came as no surprise. I thought the time was due. Many argued that at 25-2, he was the greatest of all time, but he decided to put that entire legacy on the line when he made the highly anticipated return, upper weight division, to fight Michael Bisping at UFC 217. His return set the Canadian pay-per-view record, surpassing the Floyd Mayweather and Conor McGregor boxing match from just 2 months earlier. Obviously, GSP went on to defeat Bisping in that fight to become the middleweight champion of the world, only the 4th person in history to become the champion in multiple divisions, cementing his name in the GOAT discussion for basically from now until the end of time, DL. GSP does not go anywhere, and that was a massive deal. So UFC 217 comes in at number 3, Statman.
I believe UFC 217 had 3 title fights as well, and that was a huge event. UFC 200 was an event that was meant to have 3 title fights on it as well, until Mr. John Jones decided to ruin everything there. But number 2 on our list is Mr. Brock Lesnar, who fought on UFC 200 after establishing himself as an international star in the WWE. Probably one of the most hotly anticipated debuts in the UFC was when he transferred over and dominated Heath Herring, and then lost to Frank Mir, but eventually battled his way back up to become the dominant force in the heavyweight division. Health concerns kind of rattled the later half of his pro career. Diverticulitis and Cain Velasquez and Alistair Overeem saw to that, and he ended up retiring in 2011, returned to the UFC, returned to the WWE, and kind of made sporadic appearances here and there. In 2016, just as the UFC fans were preparing for the main event, Rockhold v Bisping at UFC 199, they were hit with a surprise video package, "I'm back," with Brock Lesnar on it, unless they were following Ariel Helwani's Twitter feed about half an hour earlier, which ended up getting Ariel Helwani blacklisted from the UFC. Fans around the world exploded, and Lesnar made his UFC debut less than a month later against Mark Hunt. The joy would be short-lived, of course, where despite getting his hand raised in the cage on the night, less than a month later, he would end up testing positive for a post-match banned substance, which is not necessarily a surprise considering he was competing in the WWE not too long before his return. He was ended up fined $250,000, suspended for a year, and souring one of the best returns of all time.
And who would have thought after a USADA exemption a month out from the event, where the writing wasn't on the wall for that one at all, was it, Statman?
No, they definitely claimed that there was definitely no special, nothing special given for Brock Lesnar. And And then, shock horror, he tested positive for something at the end of it.
Just quickly, Ariel Helwani, you told that story just this weekend as first time I heard it. The Dana White pulled him out the back and said basically, well, we've put a bullet in your head, your career's done. And he said, that's a weird analogy, but okay.
Yeah. Dana living his Boston gangster dreams.
Good times, which leads us to the number one overall most anticipated comeback, DL. Now, we talked about Ronda Rousey being a polarising figure. Has there been a more polarising figure than the notorious Conor McGregor? Now, obviously, he got champ status at 205, took off, fought Floyd Mayweather, took $100 million in his purse after the pay-per-view cuts. Everyone thought, are we going to see this man back? Probably not, because once you earn that sort of money, you don't ever come back. Now, those questions were answered a few years later when it was announced that McGregor was coming back. So Khabib had a little run-in with one of McGregor's training partners and good friends, Artem Lobov. We all know the story next. McGregor flew to New York with his pals, busted up a few buses, got arrested, got released, yada, yada. They set up the fight, one of the most heated lead-ins of all time to that UFC 229. Needless to say, the fight probably didn't live up to what we all hoped for. Khabib thoroughly dominated with the exception of a couple of moments here or there for Conor. But the rivalry was something that we have never seen, both in the lead-in and then the aftermath. And that probably explains why it was a $2.4 million sales in the pay-per-view DL, something that's just unfathomable when you look at the other top 10 and how many they've drawn in the pay-per-views, setting a UFC record that, look, let's face it, may never be broken, boys. So like him or hate him, no one draws a crowd like Conor McGregor, and that's why his return at UFC 229 DL goes down as the number one most iconic octagon returns of all time.